Alright guys, here we go. So, our last lesson for the Middle Ages. We're going to deal specifically with their literature. Now you guys know that I like to spend a little bit of time kind of dabbling with the myths and legends of a particular ancient society. Well, that's basically what we're going to be doing today, only unlike the oral tradition of many previous cultures that we've talked about, Egypt and Mesopotamia, the Middle Ages, they were writing stuff down left and right. So, we're going to go ahead and jump on in and start talking about these cultures. Now, before this time, the early Middle Ages, everything was handwritten, right? If you bought a Bible, it was handwritten. And they would put little illuminations, the illuminated manuscripts, that kind of stuff, in there all the time. They also would put doodles. This one down here in the middle here is my personal favorite. This is an actual doodle from the early Middle Ages of a dude with his head up his keister. Yeah. So those weird little doodles you do in the corner of your textbooks whenever you're bored and drawing like pictures of your teachers with arrows through their heads, yeah, the monks did the exact same thing. So what we have is a lot of people trying to go back and translate some of the previous writings of philosophers like Aristotle, and they're trying to translate them into Latin to kind of coalesce and condense all of philosophy. However, Brotheus, one of the guys who was attempting to do this, he was eventually executed because they were trying to turn against the Greek and Roman way of life so heavily that they wanted to kind of completely get rid of it from all of history. So unfortunately, our friend Brotheus, who was really trying to do us a favor, old bro got his head chopped off. So, switch gears. Now, we are over talking about still the early Middle Ages. We introduce a writer named Gregory of Tours. Gregory of Tours wrote a huge tome, a giant book, called The History of the Franks. I'll give you a surprise. It's about the history of the Franks. Yeah, it's pretty boring. But you know what? Gregory of Tours wasn't executed because he wrote a pretty dang boring book. If you weren't writing a Bible and you weren't writing a story about Jesus or the church, you better be writing something that's nonfiction. I want to know about the life of Charlemagne. I want to know about the history of the English church and its people. Thank you, Saint Bebe. So this is kind of the idea. Most of the writings that come out during this time period aren't really adventurous. They're either biblical or they are just straight out nonfiction, kind of telling a fact like a fact. Now, what we're going to kind of slowly shift over is after all these different kind of nonfiction stories, we introduce a thing called the Carolinian Minuscule. The Carolinian Minuscule is this thing we see here in the middle, this handwriting kind of breakdown. And it's a way of making a uniform Latin script, right? So this kind of old Middle Ages handwriting using like a quill pen and this calligraphy that you know, that's what we're talking about here. This Carolinian Minuscule is what we're getting at. And what's interesting about this is before this time, yes, everybody was writing with their main kind of Latin language. If you knew how to write, if you were able to be kind of legible and well read. But what's interesting is, let's say that you live 4 towns away from me. Because of that regionalism, because of the fact that people have different laws and different ideas in different areas, you might be 3 or 4 towns away from me, and your F might look like my H. Like it literally might have been a totally different letter. Now you know what it is, and you can read it just fine, but before the Carolinian Minuscule, before there was a unification and a harmony, language was completely disparate. Because of that Carolinian Minuscule, it made sure that all language, no matter what region you were from in Europe, looked exactly the same. That was a pretty big change. The big book to come out during this time period, other than the Bible, of course, is the story of Beowulf. Beowulf comes out in the 7th century BCE, or excuse me, AD. And it is an epic poem. It is a massive poem of a Danish warrior. If you have not had the privilege of reading Beowulf, I highly suggest you check it out. It is an awesome, action-packed story, better than any big summer blockbuster movie you could imagine. There's been a number of different movie adaptations of Beowulf, and I'd highly suggest that you watch none of them. They're all actually really bad. Read the book, I promise. It's a good read. But it's about Beowulf. He's this Danish king. and he kind of brings about, or he kind of moves into a town and helps kill an evil dragon. He kills a monster named Grendel. He eventually hunts down and kills Grendel's mother as well. And it deals with some of the Christian values and the pagan fears of this time period. Beowulf himself and the towns that he's visiting, are they Christian values that he's bringing to these rough monsters? Right? Is he taking down these pagan gods? It's kind of going back and forth a little bit, dealing with the fears that people have leaving their Roman heritage or the previous Roman heritage and switching over into this Christian way of life. It's action-packed and amazing. During the High Middle Ages, the Middle Ages, this is where we start to get into monastic and feudal hymns. So again, this is a period where kind of singing music about kings and brave people is really, really popular. That's where we introduce the French style of a canson de geste, which is basically a song of a brave deed. So whenever you think about, like, Sir Brave Robin, and you're singing a song in the woods about, Brave Robin ran away, all that, right? There's my Monty Python reference. That's called a canson de geste. It was very popular in France. We also have a vernacular. A vernacular is a type of writing and type of song where you're going through and again kind of singing these tales. So you'd have like minstrels that would walk around holding a lute, and you would pay them some money, and you'd listen to their music. They'd sing you a nice little hymn, a little song on their lute or their guitar. So this is kind of a traveling musical performance. This is also, in the world of writing, this is a time where romances were high. The tale of King Arthur comes out during the High Middle Ages. And it kind of makes sense, right? We have these knights running around during the early Middle Ages that are basically just vassals, right? They are people that are owning land and have serfs, and they're kind of jerks. Not necessarily all the time, but a lot of times they're jerks. But the idea of a knight in shining armor is a romantic concept. It's not something that actually existed, but we want to romanticize, the past, right? We still do that to this day. Think back to the 1950s. We have romanced the 1950s to kind of a Leave It to Beaver style. Well, that's not how the real world was, but we're looking back at the past with kind of rose-colored glasses. So these High Middle Ages people are doing the exact same thing. The big book, other than King Arthur, to come out during the High Middle Ages is Dante Alighieri's Divine Comedy. Now, if you haven't checked this one out, this is also a good read. If you like horror books, if you like horror novels or anything like that, anything from Stephen King, whoa, you are going to love the Divine Comedy. This is a terrifying trip through the gates of hell, all the way down to the pits of hell, where you meet up with Satan himself. Satan is frozen into the pits of hell because he's so far away from God's light. He has 3 mouths, and he is consuming people left and right. Each layer of hell gets worse and worse. There's the woods of suicide, where if you commit suicide, you become a tree, and the only way for you to yell and scream is whenever flying bird women, these harpies, soar down and they lash you with a whip. And as you bleed in your tree human form, you scream out as loud as you possibly can. Now, the Divine Comedy starts by a trip of a man named Virgil and Dante himself, and they travel deep down into the pits of hell, and they see the woods of suicide, they see the devil, and then eventually they start climbing back out, and they eventually will travel all the way through and out of hell and into heaven as well. It's a magical book. It's really, really amazing. If you like kind of, again, the scarier parts of biblical storytelling, definitely check out the Divine Comedy. Finally, we hit the late Middle Ages. We introduce a fellow named Petrarch. Petrarch is a really good author. He sits down and he starts to kind of write for the popes. He wants to write down the concepts, the teachings of the popes. He wants to write down their stories, their history. He starts to canonize some of their songs as well. He really helps kind of to develop the church's writings. We introduced another author here named Brancaccio. Brancaccio is a writer of romances and songs and sonnets. He also lives during the plague, so he writes a couple short stories relating to the plague as well. And then we have Christine de Pizan. Christine de Pizan is a female, one of the very first female authors. She's Italian and French, and she writes a book called The Book of the City of Ladies. And this is a really important book for historical research because it tells the life of a woman living during this time period, just her day in and day out life. But how many books are written about women to this day? Right? Back in the 1300s, this was a woman who was writing about her life and her experiences, and it really lets us in on what it was like to be a human during this time period. The big book to come out during the during the late Middle Ages is the Canterbury Tales. You might have had an English teacher force you to read a couple passages out of this. Plenty of people love this book. I'm not going to lie, it's not my favorite. But that being said, the story itself is about 31 different pilgrims, people traveling from town to town, and they are trying to go on a pilgrimage to the Holy Land, to Jerusalem. Now, along the way, they come up with a way to pass the time, and they say whoever can tell the best story will win a prize. Well, as we go through the book, there are 23 of the 31 pilgrims that tell different stories. And what's interesting about this, similar to Christine de Pizan, each one of their stories is telling a little bit of a slice of life during this time period. So there's a knight who tells a story about being a knight. There's a shop owner who talks about being a shop owner, and just goes through the slices of life kind of tales collected under one big story called the Canterbury Tales. The last thing we're going to get into here is the movable printing press. We talked last class about the idea of Johannes Gutenberg inventing this printing press, and the first thing he starts to print and mass produce is a Bible. Now, up until this point, every single Bible would have been handwritten, and that would have taken a lot of time to make that happen. So, what he does is he goes through and he uses a movable printing press. So he creates this device where you would take metal slugs with little tiny letters, or wooden slugs, excuse me, little cubes of wood, and on the top would be a hand-carved letter. Letter A, letter B, letter C, so on. You would move these little letters around and kind of place them to make a sentence, to make a paragraph. And then I would roll ink across it like a stamp. And I would press really hard and put a piece of paper in between. And I press really hard, and I would go through and add that to my page. Now, once I've gone ahead and made one page, instead of switching out my letters, I would print 50, 60, 100 of the exact same page. Then I would go through, move my text around, and make page 2. Make 50, 60, 100 prints of page 2, so on and so forth, until I've completed the entire book. So even though it's going to take me a long time to complete one single book, when I'm done, I haven't completed one book, I've completed hundreds of books. What this does is a huge change. If you were a commoner and you did not have the ability to read or write, what you suddenly did was you were able to get your hands on one of these Gutenberg Bibles. You would take these Gutenberg Bibles with you to church, and once you took that Bible with you, you could kind of follow along with what the priest was talking about. A lot of times these Bibles would be translated not in Latin, but into German or some kind of local language that you'd be able to understand. So you'd now be able to start to teach yourself to read and write. And if you can teach yourself to read and write, you can then go pick up a different book and teach yourself a skill. The second you have the ability to teach yourself is the second you're able to rise above your lot in life. You can leave the class that you're in and start to elevate yourself, save up your money, and then get the heck out of town if you want to. So this ability to mass produce dramatically dropped the price, the cost, of buying a Bible or buying any kind of book. Pretty soon it became, you would see people walking around town holding these books and being able to be learned men. Before this time, during the early Middle Ages, only the priest class would have the ability to read and write. So this is a big, big change, and it really helps things. But it also causes the downfall of the Catholic Church. During this time period, the Catholic Church is selling things called the indulgences. And basically, it's a get-out-of-jail-free card. If you have money, you show up to a priest or the Pope, you give him a bag of gold, and you say, you know, I did some sinning today, I did really bad things, and the Pope says to you, no problem, I'll take your money, I'm going to write you a little IOU letter, and whenever you die, you just take this indulgence, this piece of paper, and you go ahead and give it to God, and he's going to understand that you know, I wrote it off. Now, that sounds like a pretty shady thing to do. It sounds like you're selling, you know, a free gateway into heaven if you have the right amount of money. And so a lot of people start to get frustrated. A lot of educated people start to get frustrated. Primarily a fellow named Martin Luther. And Martin Luther eventually hangs 95 theses, or reses, on the door of the church. Basically, a thesis is an argument, a complaint. He hangs 95 different complaints against the church. people get so upset and so irate at the church that they start separating themselves and they go off and form their own church. And this is where Lutheranism, this is where Protestantism, this is where baptism, all these other churches start to splinter away, and the Catholic Church starts to lose its stranglehold over these people's lives. This is where a lot of things are going to change. All of this religious changing, the fact that you can teach yourself, this is all building towards a big head, which is going to be the Renaissance, this explosion, this rebirth. So, as we kind of wrap up the Middle Ages, it started out as a darker time period, but eventually ended with a period of human history which allowed people to educate themselves. And the second you're able to educate yourself, you are able to grow dramatically. And that's exactly what people are going to do.